So what you're about to watch is a VHS that was recorded in 2002 that contains evidence that 9/11 was an inside job. It exposes the war on terrorism, the military industrial complex, the intelligence agencies. It's pretty amazing information, especially for being recorded only a year after the actual event itself. Now, a lot of this information might be old information to the people who've been diving into this subject for years, but it's a great introduction video for people who don't know anything about it. And I guarantee there's some stuff you probably haven't heard on here as well. So this was actually given to a friend of mine by a stranger on the streets in 2003. And 20 years later, she found it and gave it to me. I converted it to digital, and this is going to be the first time anyone's seen it in 20 years. I'm sure that the footage on here has been leaked other places, but we're just doing our due diligence. I feel like it's a responsibility to keep this information going so it doesn't get lost in history. But before that, you're going to see a short clip from a John Lear interview. John Lear was a former Air Force pilot, and he had information on what really happened at 9/11. I uploaded this short clip on TikTok last year on 9/11, only for it to be removed a few hours later. I do believe there is something to the information he was sharing. And just to ensure that that information doesn't get lost as well, we're going to play that first, and then it's going to segue into the film.
The World Trade Center 1 and 2 were destroyed by these satellites. They're using molecular dissociation. And what they do is just take apart the makeup of concrete and steel. And that's what all that dust was floating around Manhattan. It was just the steel and concrete coming apart into particles 80 microns in diameter. And what happened is after everything was done and said, they wanted to build a new set of towers. And what they found out was this was the first time that this weapon of molecular dissociation had been used at apparently full power. Well, what happened is they found out that it was not self-quenching. And what that means is after they quit firing it, the effects didn't stop. So that when they started to build the buildings where the World Trade Center were, they would immediately rust, and they couldn't build there. So what they did is they made a reflecting pool in there that is the exact dimensions of World Trade Center 1 and 2, and that was, they said that was for in memoriam of the people that were killed there. But the reason the reflecting pool is there is because they couldn't build anything there, and then they built the new buildings around that reflecting pool.
And it was okay, so if I was a junior, then 9/11 was 2 years prior. So I guess we're talking 2003. And, okay, so I'm waiting across the street, and out of, like, nowhere, this, like, hippie dude, runs up to me, like, and I mean, I'm in a crowd of people, and just picks me out of the crowd, stands in front of me, and hands me that. And I'm like, it's also wrapped up, like, in, like, a bag. And he goes, I could tell that this will be in good hands with you. And I was like, what is it? And he's like, well, just, you'll see. He's like, if you should watch it now, and then you should hide it and put it away, and you'll know the time when it's right to pull it back out. I was like, whoa, okay. And he's like, you don't want to get caught with this, and you probably won't need to let it surface for a few years. And then he just, like, ran off. And I was like, what the hell? Super freaked out. I get back to my dorm, and I watch it, like, instantly, because I'm like, what is this? And I obviously believed it, and I was like, whoa, like, this is wild. And I was so scared, I hid it. And I did pull it out, like, a year later to show someone else, and then I hid it again, and then it never surfaced until I just refound it, like, a few weeks ago when I was going through my Edgar Casey books. It, like, fell out in between these books, and I was like, whoa. And then I was like, well, I know exactly where this has to go. And so I took it to Jim and I was like, can you get this to Tyler? And he was like, oh yeah.
When you're watching a news report, have you ever had the feeling that something's fishy, that the event is not as it appears and not as reported? I get that feeling fairly often. Sometimes I'm just being paranoid. Hey, nobody's perfect. But other times that skeptical light bulb goes off for a good reason. A little historical perspective. Here are two important events, each reported and accepted as authentic fact at the time. Each was, in reality, an elaborate deception planned at the highest levels and executed to sway public opinion. August 2nd, 1964. In the Gulf of Tonkin, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attack the U.S. destroyer Maddox. The Associated Press story, for some reason, is datelined Pearl Harbor. The lead. 3 PT boats, identified by Secretary of State Dean Rusk as North Vietnamese, attacked. Later, a second U.S. destroyer is attacked. Although no U.S. sailor suffers a scratch, the American public is outraged. President Lyndon Johnson goes on television to ask the country to support war action. 2 days later, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution is approved by the U.S. House of Representatives unanimously, then by the Senate 88-2. The resolution becomes the entire justification for the United States war against Vietnam. Before that's over, 58,000 American soldiers and almost 3 million Vietnamese die. One small problem. There never were any PT, patrol torpedo, boats. The events never happened. As Secretary of State Rusk, the President, and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara knew. They knew because they planned the deception. One source for this is former Admiral James Stockdale in his book In Love and War. On the night in question, Stockdale was at the controls of a Sabre jet flying cover for the 2 destroyers. He saw nothing. Another source is Ben Bradlee, much respected former managing editor of the Washington Post. Bradlee, in a public lecture in England in April 1987, states, "The so-called facts behind this critically important resolution were quite simply lies." August 2nd, 1990. Iraq attacks Kuwait, claiming the Kuwaitis are slant drilling into Iraq's oil fields. U.S. President George Bush pushes for a land war against Iraq, but polls show the U.S. public is split 50-50 on that idea. Then comes this eyewitness testimony before a congressional committee from a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl who cannot be identified for fear of reprisals.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, took the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The U.S. public is outraged. Support for land war zooms. It's a turning point. Desert Storm is launched. 135,000 Iraqis are killed. Large numbers die since from sanctions still in effect. One small problem. There never were any incubator baby deaths, not one. The CBC's The Fifth Estate reveals the girl was the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, given her lines and coached in acting by the giant PR firm Hill and Knowlton. This was one phase of a $10 million joint U.S.-Kuwaiti campaign of deception. This man is lying.
I myself buried 14 newborn babies that had been taken from their incubators.
This man is lying.
They had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
There were a lot of people in on what can fairly be described as a conspiracy of fake organizations, false documents, fraud, and disinformation. For 4 months, I've been waiting in vain for the North American media to pursue questions about the startling events of September 11th. Here's what I want to know. The multiple hijackings are unprecedented. The first occurs at 7:45 in the morning. It's a full hour before the first plane hits the World Trade Center. But it's an hour and 20 minutes, and after the second plane hits, that the president allegedly becomes informed. Think about that. Then he gives no orders. Why? He continues to listen to a student talk about her pet goat. Why? It's another 25 minutes until he makes a statement, even as Flight 77 is making a beeline for Washington, D.C. In the almost 2 hours of the total drama, not a single U.S. Air Force interceptor turns a wheel until it's too late. Why? Was it total incompetence on the part of air crews trained and equipped to scramble in minutes? Well, unlike the U.S. Air Force, I'll cut to the chase. Simply to ask these few questions is to find the official narrative, frankly, implausible. The more questions you pursue, it becomes more plausible that there's a different explanation. Namely, that elements within the top U.S. military, intelligence, and political leadership, which are closely intertwined, are complicit in what happened on September the 11th. Why U.S. complicity, you ask? Well, to stampede public opinion into supporting the so-called war on terrorism, to justify a war on Afghanistan for a future oil pipeline, the grab for Middle East oil and big budget increases for the military, and the general drive for global domination by the American empire. I know it sounds incredible, but here's some historical context from this book, Body of Secrets. Its author is James Bamford. Bamford, until recently, was Washington investigative producer for ABC's World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. I learned of this book on ABC's website. Bamford's information comes from interviews with, for instance, the former dean of the U.S. intelligence community, and from government documents. It takes 80 pages to list Bamford's more than 600 information sources. Here's the story. It's 1962. John F. Kennedy is U.S. President. Robert McNamara is Secretary of Defense. And Admiral Lyman Lemnitzer heads the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. The CIA has failed in its illegal Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. JFK decides, Bamford writes, to back away from military solutions to the Cuban problem. But Lemnitzer, the CIA, and others at the top remain obsessed with Cuba. Writes Bamford, as the Kennedy brothers appeared to suddenly go soft on Cuba, Lemnitzer could see his opportunity to invade quickly slipping away. Attempts to provoke the Cuban public to revolt seemed dead. Continues Bamford, Lemnitzer and the other chiefs knew there was only one option left that would ensure their war. They would have to trick the American public and world opinion. Lemnitzer comes up with Operation Northwoods. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. Casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. An elaborate variation. Create an exact duplicate for a civil registered aircraft. The duplicate would be loaded with selected passengers, all boarded under carefully prepared aliases. The actual registered aircraft will have been converted to a drone, a remotely controlled unmanned aircraft. The destruction of that aircraft will be triggered by radio signal. The Cubans would be blamed. Finally, another variation is described by Bamford. On February 20th, 1962, John Glenn was to lift off from Cape Canaveral on his historic journey. Lemnitzer proposed that should the rocket explode and kill Glenn, the objective is to provide irrevocable proof that the fault lies with Cuba by manufacturing various pieces of evidence which would prove electronic interference on the part of the Cubans. Thus, Bamford notes, as NASA prepared to send the first American into space, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were preparing to use John Glenn's possible death as a pretext to launch a war. The Operation Northwoods plan shows the Pentagon was capable, according to Bamford, of launching a secret and bloody war of terrorism against their own country in order to trick the American public into supporting a war on Cuba. Can we be sure, therefore, that complicity by the Pentagon in the events of September 11th is entirely out of the question? Next week, a more precise look at the events of that fateful day. And what about bin Laden? I'll have more on him too, and the arrests of people named as terrorists around the world. A common explanation as to why no U.S. military interceptors took to the skies on September 11th until it was too late is that it was simple incompetence. Well, let me deal with the incompetence theory. First, by taking you back to October 26, 1999. That is the day the chartered Learjet carrying golfer Payne Stewart crashes, killing all on board. This from the National Transportation Safety Board crash report. 9:19 a.m., the flight departs. 9:24, the Learjet's pilot responds to an instruction from air traffic control. 9:33, the controller radios another instruction. No response from the pilot. For 4.5 minutes, the controller tries to establish contact. Having failed, the controller calls in the military. Note that he did not seek, nor did he require, the approval of the President of the United States, or indeed anyone. It's standard procedure, followed routinely, to call in the Air Force when radio contact with a commercial passenger jet is lost, or the plane departs from its flight path, or anything along those lines occurs. 9:54, 16 minutes later, the F-16 reaches the Learjet at 46,000 feet and conducts a visual inspection. Total elapsed time, 21 minutes. So what does this prove? Well, it proves that standing routines exist for dealing with all such emergencies, for instance, loss of radio contact. All personnel in the air and on the ground are trained to follow the routines, which have been fine-tuned over decades, as the Learjet incident illustrates. For large scheduled aircraft tracked throughout on radar, to depart extravagantly from their flight paths would trigger numerous calls to the military, especially after two have hit the World Trade Center and now one is speeding toward Washington, D.C. It flies over the White House, turns sharply, and heads toward the Pentagon. Everyone, and I mean everyone, now knows these planes are very bad news. It's been reported on all TV networks for more than half an hour that this is a terrorist attack. Now, Andrews Air Force Base is a huge installation. It's home to Air Force One, the President's plane. It's home base for 2 combat-ready squadrons of jet interceptors, mandated to ensure the safety of the U.S. Capitol. Andrews is only 12 miles from the White House. On September 11th, the squadrons there are the 121st Fighter Squadron of the 113th Fighter Wing, equipped with F-16s, and the 321st Marine Fighter Attack Squadron of the 49th Marine Air Group Detachment A, equipped with FA-18s. This information was on the website of the base on September 11th. On September 12th, Andrews chose to update its website. I find it odd that after the update, there's no mention of the F-16 and F-18 fighters. The base becomes, according to the website, home to a transport squadron only. Yet at 6:30 the evening of September 11th, NBC Nightly News, along with many outlets, reported it was after the attack on the Pentagon that the Air Force then decided to scramble F-16s out of the D.C. National Guard Andrews Air Force Base to fly a protective cover over Washington, D.C. Throughout the northeastern United States are many air bases. But that morning, no interceptors respond in a timely fashion to the highest alert situation. This includes the Andrews squadrons, which have the longest lead time and are 12 miles from the White House. Whatever the explanation for the huge failure, there have been no reports to my knowledge of reprimands. This further weakens the incompetence theory. Incompetence usually earns reprimands. This causes me to ask, and other media need to ask, if there were stand-down orders. Next week, bin Laden was a longtime close ally of the CIA, according to the CIA itself. Why did he suddenly turn against them? Or did he? Stay tuned. Osama bin Laden is not an easy subject. Characterizations of him vary wildly. The most common, because it's the official narrative of cardboard cutout simplicity, is that he's the world's #1 villain, the diabolical mastermind behind the events of September 11th. Another view, Osama is the conscience of Islam. Well, globally, Osama is like a Rorschach ink blot. His character and role morph into what various publics project upon him, based on what they're led to believe. Take books. There's an adage you can't tell a book by its cover. Maybe so, but you can tell it by its index. Bin Laden, the man who declared war on America, is by Joseph Bodansky, former senior consultant to the Pentagon and U.S. State Department. Bodansky explains a vast global conspiracy, it says in the foreword. The index entries on bin Laden in this 440-page book run almost 2 pages. But there are just 4 references to the CIA, mostly brief, and they reveal nothing. Yet the decades-long $8 billion CIA covert operation in Afghanistan was also its largest ever, according to numerous sources, including journalist John Cooley in his book, Unholy Wars, Afghanistan, America, and International Terrorism. Contrast the Bodansky book with this one, Taliban, by Ahmed Rashid. He's a Pakistani journalist who's covered Afghanistan for 21 years. In his index are 8 entries about bin Laden and 11 about the CIA. Now back to bin Laden. What do most sources agree on? We know bin Laden is born in Saudi Arabia in 1957. Okay, we're not sure about the year. His father becomes a close friend of the king and fabulously wealthy. Bin Laden Corporation becomes one of the largest construction companies in the Middle East. In this business, you're dealing with the Pakistani intelligence, the ISI, Saudi intelligence, the CIA. With his family's blessing, Osama becomes closely associated with the CIA in the Afghan war against the Soviets. Bin Laden Corp., Ahmed writes, built major training camps for the CIA. In 1986, he helped build the Coast Tunnel Complex, which the CIA was funding as a major arms storage depot, training facility, and medical center for the Mujahideen. At this point, bin Laden's story, like Stephen Leacock's horse, rides madly off in all directions. My questions: did he turn against the CIA? Maintain ties while making anti-American statements? Was he manipulated? Former associates describe him as deeply impressionable, always in need of mentors. Rashid writes, "You're forced to turn to a larger canvas," as in the final draft of this to-be-published book, The War on Freedom, Causes and Consequences of 9/11, by Nafiz Ahmed, Executive Director of the Institute for Policy Research and Development in Brighton, England. He's an Oxfam campaigner who specializes in writing international reports on human rights. News of his reports have been carried by Reuters, Associated Press, The Guardian, The Independent, The Jewish Chronicle, and the London Jewish News. Ahmed writes that bin Laden is merely a piece in a chess game. The stakes of the game are the last of the world's oil reserves and the Bush administration's consolidation of power to pursue a drastic, unlimited militarization of foreign policy on a massive and unprecedented scale required by long-standing elite planning while crushing domestic dissent and criminalizing legitimate protest. I believe that if we shrink from testing Ahmed's overview and accept only the headlines of the day, we will fail to see the forest for the trees. The USA helped recruit, train, and equip thousands of killer mujahideen in the anti-Soviet war. Ahmed's book and other evidence shows the recruiting of and training of terrorists, including those in Al-Qaeda, has continued for years. The White House went underground with this aid. This is detailed in the 1993 book, the outlaw bank, a wild ride into the secret heart of BCCI. BCCI stands for Bank of Credit and Commerce International. It collapsed after exposure of its massive fraud and corruption. The book's authors are Jonathan Beattie and S.C. Gwynn. Beattie was an investigative reporter and senior correspondent for Time magazine. Gwynn, Time's economics editor and author of Selling Money. Further evidence of the long and deep involvement of the CIA in terrorism is found in the 1987 book, Crimes of Patriots, a true tale of dope, dirty money, and the CIA by Jonathan Whitney. Whitney, at the time, had been a Wall Street Journal reporter for 16 years. He wrote that neither the director of the CIA nor the deputy director had, in his career, shown any reluctance to shed American or foreign blood in covert military operations. The book details how some of the biggest names in American defense and intelligence were involved in an operation that promoted the dope trade, tax evasion, and gun running. Michael Springman is a Washington lawyer. He worked for the U.S. State Department's Foreign Service for 20 years. He spent 2 years as chief of the visa section at the U.S. consulate in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. He says superiors repeatedly ordered him to issue visas to unqualified applicants. It was illegal. He protested. He's just written this article in the reputable Covert Action Quarterly of Washington, D.C., and was interviewed by the CBC radio program Dispatches. I had not been protesting fraud. What I was protesting was, in reality, an effort to bring recruits rounded up by the agency and Osama bin Laden to the U.S. for terrorist training by the CIA. He details numerous cases. The State Department did not run the consulate in Jeddah. The CIA did. Of the roughly 20 Washington Dispatch staff there, I know for a certainty that only 3 people, including myself, had no ties, either professional or familial, to any of the U.S. intelligence services. Now, what bugs me to no end is that mainstream media journalists function as if these books, written by the most professional in their own ranks, they function as if these books don't exist. Fellow journalists, the dots exist. For goodness sakes, connect them while you can. There are plenty of what we call in the news business pigs, solid current evidence, new dots. But these dots, past and present, are never connected. Take this November 22nd front page story in the Globe and Mail. I almost missed the startling information in this myself because the headline indulges a stereotypical Canadian self-put-down. Us stupid Canadians, we let a terrorist, one Ali Mohammed, get away. The real story is buried. Mr. Mohammed was a U.S. Army sergeant but trained bin Laden's bodyguards. What? Ali Mohammed was in the Americans' good books. Ali Mohammed wasn't so shadowy in those days. He was one of their guys. The headline on this story might have read, USA protected top al-Qaeda operative, and it might well have been the banner. Author Nafiz Ahmed's own conclusion is that the documentation strongly suggests the United States, or more precisely, significant elements of the U.S. government, military, and intelligence, had extensive foreknowledge of the 11th September attacks and were in various ways complicit in those attacks. All this and more must be considered when asking what really happened on September 11th. And where is bin Laden, you ask? Have journalists stopped asking? Why? Journalist and former Los Angeles Police Department detective Michael Rupert quipped recently, "One guess is that he's in Switzerland having his nails done." Next week, George W. Bush and the oligarchy. Even among those who believe that the war on Afghanistan was part of the so-called war on terrorism, there's a fairly wide recognition that the outcome, the occupation of Afghanistan, might have something to do with the ambitions of U.S. oil corporations. Which brings us to the connection between September 11th and the oligarchy. Let me start with a crash course in globe oil reality, a framework little mentioned by the mainstream media. First, the size and power of big oil. Together, oil and coal constitute the biggest single industry in history, writes Ross Gelbspan in his book, The Heat is On. Big oil alone does well over $1 trillion a year in business. Second, we're at the end of the petroleum era. Total world oil extraction is peaking. These charts from Scientific American and other equally reliable sources tell the story. And the supply does not drop off gently. If you think this industry is rich and powerful now, wait till the supply is clearly on the wane. At the website www.dioff.com, you can learn that in 1995, Petro Consultants published a report for oil industry insiders at $32,000 a pop, titled World Oil Supply 1930 to 2050, which concludes that world oil extraction could peak as soon as the year 2000 and decline to half that level by 2025. Large and permanent increases in oil prices were predicted after the year 2000. Black gold is going to go platinum. Well, wait, we'll just switch to other energy sources, right? Wind, solar, biomass, tidal? Wrong. All the alternatives in the world, writes former U.S. Army officer and political analyst Stan Goff, cannot begin to provide more than a tiny fraction of the energy base now provided by oil. This makes it more than a resource, and the drive to control what's left more than an economic competition. Most experts agree, writes Larry Chin in Online Journal, that the Caspian Basin and Central Asia are the keys to energy in the 21st century. Energy expert James Dorian in the Oil and Gas Journal, those who control the oil routes out of Central Asia will impact all future direction and quantities of flow and the distribution of revenues from new extraction. In other words, a pipeline through, of all places, Afghanistan, needed to carry an estimated $5 trillion worth of Caspian oil and gas reserves to markets. A significant detail that surely is not lost on those in power in the United States. So just who are these people? Let's start with the occupant of the Oval Office himself. George W. Bush was CEO of Harken Energy. George Herbert Walker Bush, his dad and the former president, was an oil man. Now he's on the board of the Carlyle Group, which is heavily invested in oil and armaments. Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense during Desert Storm. He stepped down to become CEO of Halliburton Oil, cashed in $34 million in Halliburton stock options before taking office as vice president. Donald Evans, Bush's Commerce Secretary, was with Colorado Oil. Zalmay Khalilzad is the Bush-appointed special envoy to Afghanistan. Khalilzad previously was an aide to the American oil company Unocal. He drew up Unocal's risk analysis on its proposed trans-Afghan gas pipeline. Khalilzad reports to Condoleezza Rice, Bush's national security advisor. When she was a board director of Chevron Corporation, she served as its principal expert on Kazakhstan, where Chevron holds the largest concession of any of the international oil companies. Khalilzad will liaise with the new Afghani leader, Hamid Karzai, a former consultant to Unocal. You get the idea. A General Motors president once said, "Structure is strategy in slow motion." The structure of this cabinet shows, in my opinion, the primacy of oil interests. How does this connect with the events of 9/11? Well, it's hard to just invade a country out of the blue, I believe. The perfect pretext is a so-called war on terrorism, founded firmly, so far, upon the official narrative of what happened on September 11th. The psychological trick at the heart of September 11th, by the way, is that people confuse their compassion for the victims with their certainty about who the perpetrators are. The public was presented with instant perpetrators. The trick will most likely continue working for all future planned invasions, looks as if Iraq is next, so long as the public remains blindfolded by the media. 9/11 serves the ends of the oligarchy. That does not in itself prove a connection between big oil and what happened on September 11th. But the fact that it does serve those ends must be taken together with other evidence, just part of which is the illegal importation, training, and protection of terrorists on U.S. soil by the CIA. the much publicized failure of U.S. intelligence, the failure of the U.S. Air Force on the day, the inexplicable trades of United and American Airlines stocks in the days prior, the big economic difficulties the Bush administration was facing, and the looming Enron scandal. Next week, The Great Deception, Part 5. September 11th has brought mostly unpleasant changes, including curtailment of civil liberties and threatened perpetual war, all rooted in the official story of what happened on September 11th. Namely, that one evil man and his network are responsible, and that the U.S. military, intelligence, and political establishments were all caught totally off guard. Millions of intelligent people accept this story as their own. Any argument about any aspect of the conduct of the war against terrorism, as Globe and Mail columnist John Ibbotson puts it, must begin with those airplanes smashing into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and then it must stay there and never move from that spot. If it's that important, and I agree it is, then it's the duty of the media and of intelligent citizens to inquire about any anomalies about September 11th. Today's question: what did George Bush know, and when did he know it on September 11th?
Bush was first informed of the suicide attacks at an education event in Florida, his face creasing into anxiety. The crisis transformed his presidency.
This image, embedded in the official story, has led the world to believe that when Bush's chief of staff, Andrew Card, whispered into his ear at an elementary school at 9:05 that morning, it was the first the U.S. president learned that, in his words, America was under attack. But a growing number of people, including the careful researchers at emperorsclothes.com, don't think so. Using verifiable, publicly available information, Ilarion Bykov and Jared Israel, an intrepid Canadian, raise questions mainstream media stubbornly refuse to even acknowledge. Consider, Bykov and Israel say, the words of journalist John Cochrane, who was traveling with the president on the morning of September the 11th, on an ABC special report. Cochrane is speaking to Peter Jennings. Peter, as you know, the president's down in Florida talking about education. He got out of his hotel suite this morning, was about to leave. Reporters saw the White House Chief of Staff, Andy Card, whisper into his ear. The reporter said to the president, "Do you know what's going on in New York?" He said he did, and he said he will have something about it later. His first event is about half an hour at an elementary school in Sarasota, Florida. So Bush knew, writes Emperor's Clothes, about the first incident before leaving his hotel. Take other evidence. By 8:20, according to its own official report, the Federal Aviation Authority, the FAA, is fully aware of the unprecedented emergency in the skies. As Bykov and Israel point out, the President of the United States travels with an entire staff, including the Secret Service, which is responsible for his safety. The members of this support team have the best communications equipment in the world. They maintain contact with, or can easily reach, Bush's cabinet, the National Military Command Center and Pentagon, the FAA. In other words, around 8:46 at the absolute latest, the Secret Service and the President would have known of all 4 hijacked airliners and that one had hit the World Trade Center. That's 2 sets of proofs that question the famous whisper in the ear at 9:05. Still not convinced? How about the typically garbled words of the President himself? From the transcript of a town hall session in Orlando, Florida on December the 4th. Jordan, a 3rd grader. How did you feel when you heard about the terrorist attack? Applause. The President. Thank you, Jordan. Well, Jordan, I was sitting outside the classroom waiting to go in, and I saw an airplane hit the tower. The TV was obviously on. And I used to fly myself, and I said, well, there's one terrible pilot. But I was whisked off there. I didn't have much time to think about it. And I was sitting in the classroom, and Andy Card, my chief of staff, walked in and said, a second plane has hit the tower. America is under attack. And Jordan, I wasn't sure what to think at first. Wait a minute. The President tells us he saw the incredible image of the first plane going in. He went ahead with an easily cancelable appointment. Why? He tells us he knew his country was under attack, yet he continued to listen to a student talk about her pet goat and such for another 25 minutes. Why? Where can you find that town hall transcript? On the White House website. Thanks to a viewer on the West Coast for drawing it to my attention. In other words, no matter how you cut it, George W. Bush is acting right here. There are many other facts equally puzzling, at least for anyone still clinging to the official story of 9/11. His schedule and whereabouts had been publicly announced. Why did the Secret Service not whisk him away for safety's sake? Do you think there's anything here that mainstream media should follow up? Have you noticed any such follow-up? Do you find this as incredible as I do? What will it take to snap people out of the hypnotic trance of the official story and start asking questions? Maybe you calling an editor and raising hell. Until the world finds out the truth about what really happened on September the 11th, the world is held hostage to the so-called war on terrorism.
If we go to George Herbert Walker Bush's father, Prescott Bush, he was the managing director of a firm called Brown Brothers Harriman during the 30s and 40s. Brown Brothers Harriman financed Adolf Hitler before and during World War II. Brown Brothers Harriman got involved with the Hamburg steamship line. They got involved with a number of companies and front organizations that channeled money directly to Adolf Hitler, and they did not stop that relationship when the war began. As a matter of fact, one particular firm, it was a bank affiliated, it was the Union Bank, affiliated with the Thyssen, that's T-H-Y-S-S-E-N, Steel Trust, managed by Prescott Bush, produced 50.8% of Nazi Germany's pig iron, 41.4% of Nazi Germany's universal plate, 36% of Nazi Germany's heavy plate, 38.5% of Nazi Germany's galvanized steel, 45.5% of Nazi Germany's pipes and tubes, 22% of Nazi Germany's wire, and 35% of Nazi Germany's explosives. It was so egregious and offensive that we find that in 1942, under the Trading with the Enemy Act, the U.S. government took over the Union Banking Corporation, in which Prescott Bush was a director, and they seized the assets. That's our current president's grandfather.
In the weeks leading up to the one-year anniversary of 9/11, GNN approached 9 people who have dedicated themselves to investigating how and why the United States was attacked that September day. We asked them 11 questions. Unanswered question number 1. To what extent should airlines have been prepared for September 11th? Mary Schiavo is representing families of passengers of hijacked 9/11 planes in lawsuits against United and American Airlines.
What was really interesting is what people thought, what the government told people and how the government acted versus the real facts.
First of all, the question is not what they should have known. And I believe I can show you in just a few seconds. The question is, what did they know? And believe me, they knew a lot. Because on a September day, 4 planes were hijacked in Islamic Jihad. It shocked the world and will forever change the law under which we act. You think I'm talking about September 11. I'm not. I'm talking about September 12, 1970. Yes, we had an Islamic Jihad. 4 airplanes were hijacked. Actually, it was supposed to be 5. They were taken to Jordan. They were blown up on September 12, 1970. So in the wake of September 11, 2001, when we heard carriers and governments alike saying, oh, no one could have foreseen this, No one knew that this was coming. No one knew that there were any risks like this in the world is absolutely false. Why? Because we know that aviation is an industry which criminals go after, terrorists seek, and hijackers prey upon to make their political statements in the world. We know this.
So September 11 was literally a repeat of a fact and an event that had occurred 30 years earlier in history.
The Bush administration has changed its official story about how prepared it was for the threat of terrorism around September 11th. Unanswered question number 2, what did the Bush administration know, and when? Mike Rupert's From the Wilderness was one of the first independent news sources to raise the issue of government foreknowledge.
First of all, it's imperative to note that the Bush administration is absolutely and totally lying when it says, golly gee, we had no idea that aircraft could have been used as weapons of mass destruction to attack the United States. We know, of course, that Bush had clear briefings that al-Qaeda might be hijacking airplanes, but gee, the press forgot to tell you that on October the 24th through the 26th of 2000, the Pentagon held detailed drills practicing for an airliner being crashed into the Pentagon. The major media didn't tell you that at the G8 summit in Genoa, Italy in July of 2001, just 2 months before the attacks, all the airspace was closed off. The summit conference area was ringed with anti-aircraft guns, and the Los Angeles Times reported clearly that Egyptian intelligence and other intelligence services were afraid that hijacked aircraft would be crashed into the G8 summit to kill President Bush. It's a total lie that the administration had no knowledge. It's also a lie that the administration had no advance warning of the attacks. Intelligence reports from France, from Germany, from Russia, from Egypt, from Jordan, all of which taken together show clearly that the United States government had been warned that in the week of September the 9th, commercial airliners would be hijacked and crashed into the World Trade Center, and that ultimately, through other warnings, that they would involve aircraft from American and United Airlines. Those are very specific warnings, and that's just what we know now to this day.
The FAA, NORAD, and the U.S. military have standard operating procedures that are routinely deployed during hijackings. Unanswered question number 3. Why wasn't the U.S. military able to intercept the hijacked planes? Nafeez Ahmed's book, The War on Freedom, is one of the most detailed investigations of 9/11.
Standard operating procedures dictate that as soon as a plane flies off course, the FAA will contact the plane and try to ask them what is going on. If there is a problem or if they cannot establish radio contact, then immediately the FAA will contact the Pentagon, who will, within a matter of minutes, a maximum of 10 minutes normally, will scramble fighter jets to intercept the civilian plane and to analyze the situation and see what is going on.
In his book, Nafeez documents a timeline of September 11th, showing how the attack should have been prevented, intercepted, or terminated. In the case of American Airlines Flight 77, which departed Dulles and was crashed into the Pentagon, the FAA lost contact at 8:50 a.m. However, fighters were not scrambled until 9:24 a.m., a delay of over 30 minutes.
Now, this sort of direct violation of standard operating procedures is inconceivable without some kind of high-level government approval. If we try to explain it by using the incompetence theory, it doesn't make sense. For example, if it was incompetence, we would expect that there would have been a normal inquiry into what went wrong. We would have expected that there would be some kind of reprimands, that certain officials would be downgraded, or they would lose their jobs, or something would have happened to correct the situation. But we find that there has been no such reprimands at all.
Unanswered question number 4. How did the administration respond to the failures of the military and intelligence agencies on 9/11? David McMichael is an ex-CIA analyst and former editor of Unclassified, the magazine of the Association of National Security Alumni.
Contrary to the situation in countries with parliamentary governments, where the responsible cabinet officer following a disaster of any sort is expected to, and almost always does, resign or go fall on his sword or something like that. In the United States, this simply doesn't happen. That's not our tradition.
Despite the breakdown under his acting leadership on September 11th, General Richard B. Myers was promoted to chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military post in the country.
The worse the failure of intelligence, the more the intelligence system gets rewarded in terms of greater budgets and more personnel, on the grounds, of course, that they failed because they didn't have the resources. Well, that's often done in the military side as well. A sufficient military failure will usually bring on demands not so much for the sacking of the generals who participated in the failure, but in increasing their budget so that arguably it won't happen again.
In his 2003 budget, President Bush proposed an allocation of $396 billion for national defense, an increase of $48 billion over 2002, the largest single increase in military spending since the height of the Vietnam War. Unanswered question number 5. What ties, if any, did the U.S. government and intelligence agencies have with the terrorists or their supporters? Michel Chossudovsky's research at the Center for Research on Globalization has exposed links between the Bush administration and the terrorists.
It's well documented that the Taliban was supported by the Clinton administration. They would never have formed a government had it not been for U.S. military aid, which was channeled through Pakistan's inter-services intelligence. And that same organization supports the development of these terrorist organizations.
During the Soviet-Afghani War of the 1980s, Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency served as the critical link between the CIA and frontline rebel groups, one of which was Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda network.
The Al-Qaeda network is considered by the CIA to be an intelligence asset, and intelligence assets are controlled by their sponsors. That does not, of course, mean that Al-Qaeda is necessarily pro-American. It means that Al-Qaeda is being used to perform certain functions for the US intelligence apparatus. And it goes through a whole complex group of intermediaries. And that's why Pakistan's military intelligence has played a very important role in that context. It's important to understand that the man who, according to the FBI, is considered to be the so-called money man behind the 9/11 terrorists. I'm talking about the head of Pakistan's military intelligence, Mohammed Ahmad.
In the aftermath of 9/11, the FBI confirmed that General Ahmed, then head of Pakistan's ISI, had authorized a $100,000 wire transfer to Muhammad Atta, the alleged ringleader of the terrorist hijackers.
Well, this same individual was on an official visit to Washington from the 4th to the 13th of September, and he met Colin Powell, Richard Armitage, George Tenet, his counterpart. Now, the question you have to ask yourself, if the money man behind 9/11 is in Washington meeting top officials and at the same time sending money to the terrorists, doesn't it sound, what is the proximity group of this individual from the sociological point of view, okay? He has links with the terrorists, he has links with the Bush administration. He's buddy-buddy with George Tenet, he's buddy-buddy with Mohammed Atta. Does that not suggest that senior Bush officials should at least give us some answers of what they were doing with this guy?
Unanswered question number 6. Were there plans for a war in Central Asia prior to September 11th?
This war was coming for a long time. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had been Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, but who also worked in intelligence roles for Presidents Reagan and Bush 1, co-founder of the Trilateral Commission. He wrote a book in 1997 called The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperatives. And at 3 specific places in that book, he says the key to America's control of the world in the 21st century is the control of Eurasia.
In support of his thesis, Brzezinski states, A power that dominates Eurasia would control 2 of the world's 3 most advanced and economically productive regions, and about 3/4 of the world's known energy resources.
And then he says that without an attack on the order of Pearl Harbor, or without a direct external threat, there was no way that the American people would support the imperial mobilization necessary to control Central Asia. And in this book, again, written in 1997, Brzezinski had a map of where the next world conflict was going to be. And you look at this map in the book, and it's exactly where we're fighting now.
Unanswered question number 7. Is there an underlying motive, besides the war on terror, for the U.S. military presence in Central Asia? Peter Dale Scott has written extensively about hidden agendas in U.S. foreign policy.
There are people in the administration who believe out and out that this is the American century, that it is the time for American hegemony. Both Republicans and Democrats have said we shouldn't worry so much about what our allies think.
Despite a lack of support from America's traditional allies, the Bush administration continues to pursue military action in Central Asia.
But it's, I think, pretty clear now to everybody that America has a oil geostrategy in that part of the world.
The U.S. National Energy Policy Report of 2001, authored by Vice President Dick Cheney, formerly one of America's richest and most powerful oil industry executives, demanded a priority on easing U.S. access to Persian Gulf oil supplies.
America needs to control the world oil system. And the fact that we have put U.S. troops in Georgia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, even in Kyrgyzstan, 200 miles from the West Chinese border, all those troops there are nominally in the name of fighting the terrorists, but in reality, they have established an American presence in the great oil basin of the Caspian, and people more and more are admitting that America is a serious player in that area now because of the troops we put in.
On October 6, 2002, the UK Observer reported, the Bush administration, intimately entwined with the global oil industry, is keen to pounce on Iraq's massive untapped oil reserves, the second biggest in the world after Saudi Arabia's. Unanswered question number 8. Is there any historical evidence to suggest that the government may have used the 9/11 attacks to justify its war in Central Asia? Alex Jones is a television and radio broadcaster who has publicly questioned the Bush administration's version of what happened on September 11th.
Governments always get caught engaging in terrorist attacks against their own populations to rally them for war or for a domestic crackdown. We saw William McKinley's Navy in the 1890s blowing up their own ship in Havana Harbor as a pretext for war with the Spanish government. And that's now admitted fact. We saw Adolf Hitler blow up his own Reichstag as a pretext for martial law. Firebomb their own capital. Nazi documents have been released, now a part of historical record. Then, of course, we saw December 7th with the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor. It's now been released that 12 days before, they had Admiral Yamamoto's communique that the Japanese were going to be attacking Pearl Harbor. One of the best examples we have of the U.S. government planning terrorist attacks against its own institutions is the North Woods document. This is a confirmed, admitted document, declassified just a few years ago.
In Body of Secrets, his best-selling expose of the National Security Agency, author James Bamford revealed that Operation Northwoods called for innocent people to be shot on American streets, for a wave of violent terrorism to be launched in Washington, D.C., and for a U.S. ship to be blown up in Guantanamo Bay, all in an effort to galvanize American public support for a war against Cuba.
And they say in the Northwoods document, casualty list in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of indignation. We certainly saw a helpful wave of indignation after September 11th.
Unanswered question number 9. How has the government's reaction to the terrorist attacks impacted the rule of law in the United States? John Judge is a member of the Washington Peace Center and has researched the post-9/11 effects on U.S. civil liberties.
As of September the 11th, the entire country went into continuity of government, which is a special government that does not rely on the elected representatives, but in fact puts a small group of people in power. When you go into a declared war or a state of national emergency, which is what they went into on September 11th, legal authorities change. Hundreds of laws allow new power and new authorities for a select few people. Decisions are made not by the overt government, but by now an acknowledged shadow government. That's who's making these decisions, is DOD, FEMA, and the NSA. That's who's running the country since September 11th. They're not making it very visible, but they studied conventional explosives and weapons, chemical and biological weapons, and nuclear weapons as a three-stage approach to terrorism and counterterrorism, and at each of those levels they laid out maps that would take away more and more of the civil liberties. Eventually, when you go to martial law or into these emergency situations, they can set up detention camps and go into certain neighborhoods and round people up. The highway system, the phone system, communications, mass media, mail, all come under offices of emergency preparedness and military control once you go into these scenarios.
Unanswered question number 10. How has recent legislation, like the Patriot Act and Homeland Security Bill, affected the lives of American people? Reva Entine is an executive director of the National Lawyers Guild.
One of the greatest ironies, along with the tragedy of the Patriot Act, is that it's called Patriot. In fact, it is patriotic to defend the Constitution, and what the Patriot Act does is dismantle the Constitution.
In October 2001, the USA Patriot Act was passed into law, granting unprecedented levels of power to the Justice Department.
The greatest thing that it did is it created a new federal crime of domestic terrorism.
Under the Patriot Act, a definition of domestic terrorism is activities that involve acts dangerous to human life, that violate the laws of the U.S. or any state, and appear to be intended to influence the policy of government by intimidation or coercion.
That's domestic terrorism. Now, intimidation or coercion are very mild words when you think about it. What about people going out on strike? What about Rosa Parks sitting in the front of the bus? What about the sit-ins at the lunch counters? Those are all intended to intimidate or coerce government institutions. And if somebody had the possibility of being injured as a result, that would have been domestic terrorism. Martin Luther King would have been a domestic terrorist. In addition to this new federal crime of domestic terrorism, some of the aspects that are quite troubling include this sneak and peek provision. So now the police can go in to your house and search your house without a warrant if you're not there. They also have this roving wiretap provision, where it used to be that they would have to get a warrant for your particular phone, and now the warrant applies to any phone that you might touch. That could be your mother's phone, that could be your friend's phone. Any phone you might touch is subject to a wiretap.
Also in the Patriot Act is the new designation of civilians as enemy combatants.
Citizens deemed enemy combatants can be held indefinitely with no charges against them, no right to see an attorney, no right to go before a judge. And this category of enemy combatant isn't even defined. So at this point, anybody who's suspect can be denied all due process rights guaranteed under the Constitution. The Homeland Security Act, which passed about a year later in November 2002, outlines in great detail the degree to which the government can now spy, listen in, record, get access to internet, library cards, bookstore records, medical records, school records, phone conversations. The Patriot Act did some of this. The Homeland Security expands it so that there's really no area of our lives that are free from government intrusion.
In conclusion, we asked our interviewees, what are your final thoughts and what can we do?
On September the 11th, 4 commercial airliners were hijacked Two of them were crashed into the World Trade Center buildings in Manhattan, New York. One was crashed in Pennsylvania, and another was crashed into the Pentagon. This set off a crossing the Rubicon of human existence, a change in our lifestyle, a change in human civilization, which people are just beginning to understand about a year after the fact. That was a day that changed all of our lives forever in ways that we're just beginning to see. But the run-up to September the 11th, the historical context in which it occurred, is a much darker, much deeper political and economic story that cannot be explained away by the trite and simplistic explanations given by the administration or the news media.
Well, I don't think we yet know what happened on September the 11th, but we're being presented in the same way that we always are, with a world that we know nothing about, with people that supposedly we're told hate us for reasons we can't comprehend. We're being told, for instance, that the reason that they bombed the trade towers in the Pentagon is that they hate us because we're a democracy, because we're a pluralist society, because we have an open society and they can't stand that, or because we're large and have a great deal of wealth. Well, if that's the case, why aren't they bombing Canada? Canada's a pluralist, large society, but it has a much different foreign policy, doesn't it? And so what's happened is that the American people, separated from their own history, have no idea what has been done in their name all around the world in those intervening 50 years since the end of World War II.
It was Mussolini who said it, and not only him, not only he, that war is the health of the state. In other words, in time of war, the people who govern are given typically almost free rein to do as they wish without much question. All people who govern. And a matter of fact, George Bush has said it on at least 2 occasions. You know, it'd be so much easier if I were a dictator. I paraphrase closely. This is what the people who govern want. I mean, no one in a position of power, wishes to be restrained by such things as law, or constitutions or public opinion. I mean, a simple examination of history through a political science lens will tell you that. So, yes, people seize these opportunities and run with them.
Just after September 11th, there was a great deal of sympathy from Europe, from Russia, from everyone. And at that time, the Bush administration was able to pursue a variety of international policies that had previously been vehemently rejected by its own allies. What's happening now is that as the United States continues with the war on terror, including the upcoming imminent invasion of Iraq, threats against Saudi Arabia, threats against Iran, threats against many, many countries around the world which happen to be of strategic interest to the United States. The US allies have grown increasingly worried about US policy, which is basically very unilateral and is based on a lack of consultation with its allies. So I think public opinion is now beginning to go back to the pre-September 11th stage of hostility towards US policy.
I like to quote John Adams, who I think put his nail on the head. He said, it's the established order of things that whenever a nation rises to such a height of power that it loses its wisdom and moderation, it will in the end also lose its power, which will come back when its sense of moderation returns. Now, he was talking about Great Britain. But what was true of Britain then, and I think he was absolutely right, and it was true of Napoleon, who went crazy, thought he could march into the heart of Russia, the heart of Asia, and it was a disaster. Hitler thought he could march into the heart of Asia, it was a disaster. We are about to march into the heart of Asia, apparently. And if we do, and it's not clear that we will, but if we did, I think that it would be seen 100 years from now as the beginning of the decline of American hegemony.
Yeah, 1 year later, in the aftermath of September 11, the Bush administration is waging a war in Iraq, in Palestine, in Afghanistan. It's a war without borders, it's a war of conquest. It responds to economic and strategic considerations. It has nothing to do with the war on terrorism. Within the United States, fundamental freedoms have been rescinded through the Patriot Act. Fundamental rights of free expression are being, again, also rescinded. People are being arrested arbitrarily for presumed links to the terrorists, when in fact the people who have ordered these arrests themselves have links to the terrorists. That's the question we have to ask, and that's what defines the criminalization of the state. It's when war criminals call the shots and decide who are criminals.
Years from now, when people analyze what happened in the wake of 9/11, it will be a very, very dark day in the history of American legislation and legal history, because for the government to rush to protect corporations, foreign corporations and airlines, and negligent wrongdoers against dead and dying and injured Americans, it will be a very dark day. And they were willing to strip them of their legal rights to do so. Shocking. And to do that in retrospect, to harm them in hindsight because of what the government and the airlines failed to do. It will be a very dark day in American legal history. And probably worst of all is the realization, and many senators have now admitted it, that they were contacted by lobbyists seeking a bailout and immunity for the negligent, not on September 12th or 13th or 14th. On September 11th, the lobbying started. While bodies were still burning, Congress was crafting protections for the negligent against the burning and dead.
Dissent has never been more critical for us to engage in with all of the energy and all of the commitment that we can muster. Because without these voices of dissent, we will not be the full society that we cherish. And the government is taking us on an illegal path. And it is our voices that must demand that they follow the Constitution and follow the law. When people say what we should be doing, people need to mobilize at the local level, at the grassroots level. There are now about 30 municipalities around the country that have passed resolutions to demand repeal of the Patriot Act. It's a very good thing for people to do. People are also negotiating at the local level with their local law enforcement that local law enforcement should not cooperate with federal law enforcement in terms of INS or the Department of Justice, the FBI. People need to encourage people to speak out, encourage their local governments to speak out.
As this system squeezes more and more people, as this system begins to dominate more and more people and displace more and more people, folks are going to be looking for answers. You need to be educated to be leaders in your area to give them those answers and how we can rebuild our society on decency and honor and things that have really made societies work in the past. We've got to start honoring creativity, honoring individuality, and not this mass-marketed slave hell that they've created. Now is the time to fight this dehumanization. Now is the time to realize you're special and you have power and you can affect change, and that we're in a war for the very future of humanity. It's that important, and you're a soldier on the front lines. So get out there and take it back to them, 110%. You don't have a choice, ladies and gentlemen. Run your own life, or somebody else is going to run it for you.
We are witnessing a sequential war. Dick Cheney told us this is a war that will not end in our lifetimes, to control the last remaining significant oil reserves on a planet which is at the end of the age of oil, or nearing the end of the age of oil. There is good data which has now been acknowledged post 9/11. I've been shocked to see in recent months CNN and the British Broadcasting Corporation did an excellent piece recently acknowledging peak oil, acknowledging that we are now using 4 barrels of oil for every new barrel that we discover, and within the next few years we will be using 6 barrels for every barrel that we discover. We are on the downslope of a production curve, and the price of each barrel of oil produced in the aggregate will be forever more expensive. That economies rise and fall based upon the price of energy. We've said all that, and I've said that this war will go, and this war will go to Colombia. It will go to Nigeria and West Africa, Central African Republic, Sub-Saharan Africa, south of Morocco, new oil discoveries, Kerr-McGee, major companies moving in, special forces moving in right along with them. And this is a game of musical chairs for energy. Because energy represents the ability to do work, and oil is not just about SUVs, and oil it's about food. It takes 10 calories of energy to produce every calorie of food in the world right now. And oil and natural gas, twin sisters, enable 1 acre of land that produces 30 bushels of corn to produce 135. So when the hydrocarbons go away, how do you replace that? And all of the cheap alternative energy solutions that are being offered are not good answers. Hydrogen takes more energy to produce. By the way, commercial hydrogen is now produced from steam, which is produced by using either electricity or natural gas to boil water. Create energy, they store energy. Ethanol is a complete joke. It's 45% more energy involved in making ethanol than you get from burning it. It's a gift to Archer Daniels Midland. Okay, so what's needed to be understood here is the enormity of the crisis that is facing us. And I was discussing with Peter. I have a contributing editor for Energy, Dale Allen Pfeiffer, who's done a lot of research. I have spoken to oil company executives, one a major oil company attorney who I introduced Peter to some time ago for a story I was working on. We've produced oil company records in what was perceived to be a major bonanza in the Caspian Sea basin of 250 billion barrels. It has turned out to be only about 40 billion barrels of oil. And get this, under the best of circumstances, by hard records, there is only 30 years, 35 years worth of oil left to run the planet if we could keep consuming at current rates. Now, in that happening at the world around, and I look at what's happening post 9/11, of course, we all know there's a Patriot Act 2 now that has been leaked. It was leaked by someone, I think, with some great ethics inside the Department of Justice because it hadn't been introduced. It's going to go beyond Patriot 1. Well, I've written heavily about biowarfare, and I've come to a conclusion, and you can all see possibly Henry Kissinger sitting back at some point and saying, well, the problem is not that there is too little oil. The problem is that there are too many people. And there has been an enormous preoccupation with biological warfare, including some ultra-draconian legislation. And I've consulted some with the Office of Congressman Ron Paul, looked at Homeland Security Act, and when meshed with portions of the public health laws, the federal government now has the ability to declare an emergency and forcibly inoculate you against your will and incarcerate you if you refuse to receive the vaccination. At the same time, having held the vaccine makers absolutely harmless if you drop dead, and you can't sue them. We are living in a fascist state, and I say the word fascist very precisely. In the 1920s and 30s, the term fascism and corporatism were used interchangeably. This was before fascism became identified with Adolf Hitler. Benito Mussolini, I quote him in my upcoming book, Crossing the Rubicon, America's Descent into Fascism at the End of the Age of Oil. Benito Mussolini is saying fascism should more properly be called corporatism because it is the perfect merger of power between the corporation and the state. Interesting, in his recent State of the Union address, George W. Bush referred to the 3 great evils of the last century: Hitlerism, communism,
and militarism. He couldn't bring himself to say the word fascism because he is one. And he knows that he is one. And I get asked often about what we can do, and now I'm beginning to learn and see some things about what we can do. But before we can learn what we can do, we have to tell ourselves the truth about what is. We cannot delude ourselves into thinking. How many people have ever read any writings by Stan Goff, former U.S. military academy instructor at West Point, retired Master Sergeant of Green Beret? I posted a brand new story that Stan wrote for me today that's a breakdown analysis of the Iraqi war, and it's some of the best writing I've ever seen. It was so good I had to sit down and smoke a cigarette after I read it. Stan has yeah, now he's going to slap me for smoking again. But Stan makes a point that's right on line with me, it's in complete agreement with me, is that the quote-unquote progressives and the anti-war movement have failed miserably. You blew it. And I'll tell you why you blew it. You went out in the streets and you turned out millions of people, bravo, and you said no war in Iraq. No war in Iraq, as if the war in Iraq was the real problem. And the war in Iraq is not the real problem. The war in Iraq is a symptom, and what happened? We had the war, we had a few demonstrations, now the war is over, now everybody's going, what do we demonstrate about? We have to focus on what's real. What's real and what the problem is this. You have $600 billion a year in drug profits sustaining an illegal economic system that is run like organized crime. You worry about $48 billion increase in the Pentagon defense budget when you miss the fact that over 2 years, $3.3 trillion of your money has been stolen out of the Pentagon. And you have to address the underlying root causes. There are a lot of things that can be done. These conspiracies, you have to disabuse yourself of any knowledge. My biggest role is to teach people how things work, because that's how I got into this mess 25 years ago, by seeing a conspiracy firsthand and almost losing my life behind it. In my book, I identify 3 key focal points that people haven't talked about with 9/11. Four, actually. First of all, Carl Rick Inderfurth, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a State Department high-ranking official who transcended the Clinton administration to the Bush administration and was the handler for the Taliban, who set up 9/11. And I connect him across both administrations to preparing for 9/11. I find one supervisory FBI agent, Dave Frasca, who ran the Radical Fundamentalist Unit in Washington, D.C., that actively suppressed 5 separate investigations, each of which could have prevented 9/11, and yet he was promoted immediately after the attacks. I take the great work on the hijacked airplanes and the fighters, and I track them down even further, building on incredible research by other people, and I find one single person on 9/11 who controlled or was the counterman point, and that's the National Hijack Coordinator, a one-man position who was taking his orders directly from the Pentagon. Conspiracies don't need 10,000 people. They just need a few people to be carried out, but what they need also is hundreds of millions of people out there who don't want to assume the risk and the responsibility for getting to the root causes. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mike, and I want to pick up where you left off about, I don't want to fault the anti-war movement, especially because I know how much work it takes to put a movement together, but we're facing a crisis right here at home, not just a crisis in Iraq. We have to remember that all the questions that have come up about 9/11 should remind us of other questions that came up. We had another big bombing back in Oklahoma City. And we've had, of all people, the right wing in this country insisting for some time now, and I think quite correctly, that Terry Nichols, who was the #2 man in that conspiracy, had in the Philippines been staying in the same boarding house as members of an Islamic group that were associated with Al-Qaeda. Now, what is really going on here, I don't know, but we live in an atmosphere of traumatic events surrounded by mystery. And one of those traumatic events, I would say, was the hijacking of the election in the year 2000. And we're not here to talk about that election, but I do want to say that, you know, I've used this phrase, deep politics, all the time, and I'm going to quote in a moment from my book about it. But that what seemed on the surface was angry right-wing Christians stopping John McCain in South Carolina, analyzed a bit more closely, is a very powerfully financed and organized campaign by Ralph Reed, who was doing this as head of the Christian Coalition, but he's actually on the payroll of Enron. Enron was paying him $10,000, $20,000 a month, ostensibly to campaign for deregulation in Pennsylvania. But he wasn't in Pennsylvania. He was down there in Carolina getting out the Christian vote to stop McCain. And in all, he got $500,000 from Enron. So it was the Enron election. And if there wasn't very much zip to the election, it was because Enron was not only the biggest corporate donor to the Republicans, it was one of the biggest corporate donors to the Democrats as well. No wonder they went bankrupt. They had already achieved what they had to achieve before they went bankrupt. So we are living in a whole atmosphere which is to create the possibilities for minorities to govern acquiescent majorities. Bush never won the election in 2000. He didn't win the popular vote nationally. If everyone who had the right to vote in Florida had been allowed to vote, he wouldn't have won it in Florida either. Just as Hitler never won a majority in an election in Germany. But the acquiescent majority allowed him to take over just the same. I really recommend you read a book called Defying Hitler by Sebastian Haffner, which is an indictment of himself and his fellow citizens for just allowing Hitler to happen. I don't want to sound as if I think Bush is just another Hitler. There are a great many things that Hitler did that won't happen here. We certainly don't torture people. We just hand them over to other people to torture. There is actually still some kind of difference there. Now I want to quote a little bit, plugging my own book, Drugs, Oil, and War. I have a long paragraph in which I use the term deep politics, and this is how it goes. Covert power is like nuclear power. It produces noisome and life-threatening byproducts which cumulatively are more and more threatening to the environment supposedly served. The byproducts of covert power include trained terrorists, who in the end are likely to target their former employers, the incriminating relations to government which hinder these terrorist prosecution, and the ensuing corruption of society at large. The result is deep politics, the immersion of public political life in an immobilizing substratum of unspeakable scandal and bad faith, and the result in practice is 9/11. Because 9/11 was clearly, if we believe the government, and to some extent I do, had to do with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is clearly and demonstrably the end product of a system which was set up in the early 1980s to help fight the Russians in Afghanistan. And what it was originally was the three governments were involved: Saudi money, Pakistani organization, and behind it, U.S. training and expertise, not only to train Afghans to commit terrorist acts in Afghanistan, but also, more importantly, to bring in outsiders, people who were not Afghans, and to train them as well. And there was a special office that did this, the Maktab al-Khidamat. And as the war scaled down in 1988, the office kept going. It changed its name. Bin Laden had already been there connected with the office. They created a new office, which they called Al-Qaeda, to continue to train these terrorists, because America continued to use these terrorists and outside of Afghanistan. By about 1984, Casey, who was the head of the CIA at the time, he, and like Brzezinski before him, they had their eyes on using the war to destabilize and hopefully destroy the Soviet Union, as in fact they did. So the people that they trained in these training camps were now being sent over the river, the Oxus River, into what was then still the Soviet Union, is now Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and we were actively, America was in the forefront of actively organizing those people to go in and stir up Islamist trouble in those republics. And as the war ground down, and then when the Soviet Union collapsed, and you now had these new Central Asian republics, CARs we call them, or the Asian stands, their future was up for grabs. They were being run by ex-communist dictators, but the only significant opposition to them was this Islamist opposition. Iran was making a big push to spread Shiite propaganda among them. That was an excuse for the Americans to continue to subsidize the Pakistanis and the Saudis in creating a Sunni Islamist presence in those states to combat Iran. This is all very relevant to what we're talking about, because by training all of these terrorists, we don't call them terrorists when we use them, we just call them terrorists when they're used against us. But it's the same people. We train them how to blow things up. We train them how to kill people. And we use them not just in the central stands. When we went in Kosovo, it was to support the ELK, which was essentially, or the KLA, I guess you call it in English, it was essentially an Islamist army that up to that time had been trained and armed and supported by bin Laden's people. Mike told me just as we were coming in here that Hosudovsky has found a document establishing that some of the terrorists in Chechnya, it's well known that they were bin Laden's, but Hosudovsky apparently has a document, I haven't seen it, so I'm being a bit cautious here, which establishes that at least one group of these Chechens, trained by bin Laden, was being actively supported as a CIA cell. So this is what I'm talking about in my definition. You create all these people and you supply them, but you are giving them leverage on you because you share a secret with them, and they know that if they act against you, there will never be an honest accounting in the home country because there is too much that is shared. Now, I don't have time to go into it. I thought we were going to have a bit more than 10 minutes, but very briefly, the Al-Qaeda people linked up with a pre-existing conspiracy were already responsible for the World Trade Center bombing of 1993. Ramzi Youssef, his uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, wherever they were born, they are two Pakistanis, and at least one of them, and perhaps both, actively supported by the Pakistani ISI. And they not only blew up the Trade Center in 93, and some of their members said they were going to do it again. But in 95, the Americans were able to block a second conspiracy, the so-called Project Bojinka,
which involved simultaneously blowing up airliners, and according to many accounts, we don't see the primary documents here, that some of them were planned to be simultaneously run into American buildings way back in 1995. Remember that when you hear that America said that we were totally caught off guard and we'd never known about this. Americans had double agents in Al-Qaeda and in the Project Bojinka group, which melded with Al-Qaeda from the very beginning. They say that the World Trade Center was supposed to have used dud dynamite supplied by a double agent, but you can never control a double agent, and the dynamite turned out not to be a dud after all. So I think that I'm not one who thinks that Bush said, well, this is how we're going to blow up the World Trade Center. That's not my model of it at all. It is that you have, as you go down the line, you get increasing involvement with these people by people, some of whom are double agents, triple agents, and their handlers who know what's going on isn't Turkey, but they don't report it all. And it was a disaster that was waiting to happen, and it was extremely useful, again, not only to the neocons and the oil people, the two big factors who both want war in Iraq and more wars after Iraq, but it was ideal, finally, for the companies like Enron, who had the contracts in Central Asia, who had helped fudge the 2000 election, and are the people who ultimately will be running this country if we don't take it back to them and expose the leads in this mess here of 9/11 that lead back to oil companies and to people who are plotting quite independently of 9/11 to run America as a minority regime into the indefinite future. Thank you.
Wow.
It's not for sale, it's for free. It's still for free. Know your rights. It can also be downloaded from our website, nlg.org. So the National Lawyers Guild was formed in 1937 and has a long, proud history and has survived many periods of repression. The House Un-American Activities Committee called the Guild, quote, the foremost legal bulwark of this Communist Party, its front organizations and controlled unions. In fact, the Attorney General, the Attorney General listed us as a subversive organization. We beat the rap because we're lawyers, but we went through that and we survived to this day. And because of that history, I have been going to my elders and asking what they think about this period of time compared to previous periods of time. I'm 50 years old, but I was born in 52. I don't remember the McCarthy period. And pretty much everybody is saying this is worse, and for two main reasons, which I'm going to go into. One is the Constitution itself is under attack. The very notion of our constitutional government is under attack. And secondly, it's a wider net of people who are being targeted. It's not people who might know or be in the Communist Party. It's, frankly, anybody engaged in dissent and any immigrant who happens to come from a country that this government doesn't like right now. But the person who I think carries the most weight about why this period is worst, in terms of my experience, is I'm really fortunate to be getting to know Morton Sobel, who's the co-defendant of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And he served 18 years in prison because of red hysteria. And he thinks times today are worse. And it's a really sobering thought. I'm going to go back to Morton Sobel. He's a remarkable character to have survived 18 years and to be living through this period. And again, it's quite ominous if that's his read of the situation. So you don't usually use this quote, but it was just so telling. The day after 9/11, Sandra Day O'Connor was visiting Ground Zero, and she said, "We're likely to experience more restrictions on personal freedom than has ever been the case in this country." Well, unfortunately, she's right. And then as the film showed, remember Bush said, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists." What I didn't remember is how many people applauded when he said it. But it really doesn't leave much room in the middle, right? Because we're certainly not with him, and I doubt that we're terrorists in this room, although many of us would fit the description of domestic terrorists. And then, remember, Ashcroft said, "Let the terrorists among us be warned. If you overstay your visa by even 1 day, we will arrest you." So immigrant became criminal. And in fact, there's a recent thing that came out. Do you remember, did you hear that they were talking about seeing how many mosques there are in different neighborhoods to see how much surveillance should be, because mosque by definition, anyway, this is the quote. "This is not politically correct, no question about it," said one top FBI official, "but it would be stupid not to look at this given the number of criminal mosques that may be out there." Right. Scary times. And again, this is, you know, the way I see it, it's the war on dissent is the war on the Constitution and freedom of association, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion at this point. That's what's at stake. That's what I talk about when I say the Constitution is being dismantled. Thank you. So, and again, this was soon after 9/11. Ari Fleischer said, "All Americans need to watch what they say, watch what they do, for this is not a time for remarks like the thing about Bill Maher said, it doesn't take courage to drop a bomb." And it appears that people really do have to watch what they say and what they do. Recently, there was a public call by the Free Congress Foundation and other right-wing organizations for the Department of Homeland Security or the Congress to investigate the anti-war movement's leadership. They attacked Answer, said the anti-war movement is being led by communist fronts, and lamented the lack of information about such organizations since the dissolution of HUAC, and called for a succession to HUAC. And for those who don't remember, the Internal Security Act of 1950 directed the Subversive Activities Control Board to identify communist front organizations to see if they had members who were active members of a party. So some people who have been contacted really because of political association, because of political belief. A Houston art gallery had an exhibit, Secret Wars, an exhibit on U.S. covert operations and government services, visited by the FBI. In North Carolina, somebody was investigated by the FBI for un-American material, which was a poster of George W. and the death penalty. Prison activists in New York were questioned about political organizations and activists. None have anything to do with the Middle East, and they were asked, given a list of names, do you know, do you know? The important thing is that everybody has a right not to talk to any government agent, that's citizen, non-citizen, and juvenile. And the National Lawyers Guild recommends that nobody talks to any government agent before talking to an attorney, and we provide free attorneys for that purpose. In New York recently, well, in May of last year, Ashcroft announced new guidelines which removed minimal restrictions on the FBI requiring some criminal activity to conduct political surveillance and monitoring. And basically, the police, they repealed a New York law which kept that restriction in place. So criminal activity does not have to be a prerequisite for spying in New York, and it's happening in other places, which I might get to. But in terms of recent demonstrations in New York, demonstrators arrested at recent anti-war protests have reported being questioned by the arresting officer about their identity. They're interviewed by a second officer from the New York Police Department, Criminal Intelligence Section, which is led by a deputy commissioner who spent 35 years with the CIA. They use a demonstration debriefing form asking organization name, organization position, and prior demonstration history. They ask, what do you think of the president? What do you think of the leaders of today's protest? Do you vote? Say nothing. Say nothing. All you have to say is your name. Dozens of Latino organizations, advocacy groups received racist letters with white powder. There's just different levels of attack of people who engage in dissent or challenging government policy. I want to talk a little bit about safety, because what they're saying is that all of this repressive legislation is needed for our safety, and it's sort of getting into the international and foreign policy arena. But what I think is important to say is to validate the need for safety and security, and everybody needs to feel safe and secure in their families, in their homes, in their community. The way to feel safe and secure is by changing our foreign policy so we don't exploit people around the world. So I won't go over the Patriot Act 1 and Homeland Security, which was alluded to. One way that I sort of generalize, it's post-9/11 repressive legislation, because there's also more than 30 executive orders which have come down, which established the military tribunals, Guantanamo. One of my favorite ones is they created a snitch visa, so that you can come on a visa if you agree to snitch on people. But the flip side of it that you need to know is everything about us is now transparent, and more so under Patriot 2. But have you given me 1 minute yet? No? Close. But everything, got 2, all right. Everything about them is under secrecy. It's a flip. So Freedom of Information Act, forget it. Ashcroft has given a directive that say no, if at all possible, and I'll defend your right to say no. Everything about us is transparent. Everything about them is behind a veil of secrecy, including things like industrial emissions, so we can't lobby about what they're doing in our neighborhoods, for example. You mentioned torture, and there's degrees of torture, but in Guantanamo, I actually think there's some torture going on, although they pretend that Guantanamo isn't really the U.S., it really isn't anywhere, so maybe that's how they can say that the U.S. doesn't engage in torture. I'm going to have to skip this thing about Capitol Hill Blue Report. Check it out. There's all this talk about most alerts are issued, and this is former intelligence officials who are saying that the alerts are issued without any concrete data to back up the assumptions. Basically, they're creating fear. They're creating fear in order to justify their repressive legislation, and we have to stand up to it. All right, in terms of surveillance, one thing that I alluded to recently is in Seattle. They've had this 23-year law requiring, again, criminal activity for surveillance. They're thinking about throwing out that law to be in sync with the feds. San Francisco has a surveillance policy which is better than the feds. When I talk about working at the local level, try to maintain whatever degree of privacy that we have, that local governments have established. All right, ending here, I want to end with Morton Sobel. I finished his book 2 days ago, Undoing Time. I really recommend it. And he said 1969 marked the awakening of the American people to the true meaning of the Vietnamese War. What a contrast with the Korean War period 20 years before. Ethel and Julius could never have been executed in 1969. People could no longer be frightened into submission the way they had been in the 1950s. Now, it's interesting, I drove here and I hear that Korea might be the next on the list that we're invading. But I think we need to keep Sobel's message in mind, and we cannot stand by and let them attack people who fight for freedom. We have to resist. And I want to give 2 or 3 examples of resisting, even though now I'm over my minute. But librarians, right? Librarians are told to give information to the government and they're not allowed to tell the client, right? Well, the American Library Association magazine says that when the FBI inevitably abuses its new powers, we will need librarians brave enough to speak out, even if it means going to jail. Support your local librarians. In Santa Cruz, they've actually directed the librarians to delete the data earlier than they would have otherwise done, so they won't have the data to pass over. All right, I guess I'll end on, again, local control. In terms of Patriot Act 2, which I didn't get into, and I'm sorry, but it's just even worse. It's just more and more and more transparency, and everything is computerized, and there's no separation between industry and government. And we have to stop Patriot Act 2 from going on. And one slippery slope that they're going to do for us, because they did it in Patriot Act 1, it sailed through partly because it was supposed to sunset, some of it was going to go away, and guess what? None of it's going to go away. Don't let them lie to you again with Patriot Act 2. We have to say no to the whole thing. I think this is an exciting gathering. I think the 9/11 issue is alive and well. You're testament to that. And we all have to keep working and demand that this country follows the rule of law, domestic and international, and that if we bring some sense of humanity and equality back to this world, we can all live in peace. Thank you.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th.
The towers were built by the government, so taxpayers owned both of them. However, somehow the government was convinced to lease the towers for 99 years. Larry Silverstein became landlord on July 24th, less than 2 months before the attack. He then had control of the maintenance and security departments, and he began to replace security personnel. Silverstein brought Frank Lowy into the deal to become landlord of the underground shopping mall. Lowy is a billionaire who owns shopping malls in several nations. After the towers disintegrated, Silverstein demanded insurance companies pay him twice what the policy stated on the grounds that each tower was a separate attack. What a coincidence that after these guys got control of the World Trade Center, Osama decided to destroy the entire complex.
Now we're getting into the heart of September the 11th. I picked up this document just with the Mossad. And what they detailed, this is from the October 15th issue of From the Wilderness. Between September 6th and 7th, the Chicago Board of Options Exchange saw purchases of 4,744 put options on United Airlines and only 396 call options. A put option is basically a bet that the stock price is going to go down. It's a contract that's entered into that's irrevocable. And let's say the gentleman in the suspenders, I do a put option deal with you to sell shares at $100 in 2 weeks, 4 months. 4 months is the standard, but you can write the contract for anything you want. And he's committed now to buy the shares for $100. Well, if I know that the attacks are going to take place, I don't have to deliver the shares until the contract matures. So if I know the stock is going to crash, he enters into a put agreement with me, agrees to buy the shares at $100. The next day the World Trade Center attacks happen. The stocks are selling for $20. I go buy the shares for $20, and he has to buy them for $100. That's how a put option works. That's a short version, okay? So we saw 4,744 put options on United Airlines, but only 396 call options. On September the 10th, 4,516 put options, same deal, were placed on American Airlines, bought on the Chicago Exchange, compared to only 748 calls. There were no other similar trades on any other airlines. And this level of put options was like 600 to 1,200% above normal for United and American Airlines. Now, just these trades alone, there were also put options placed on Merrill Lynch, which had 22 floors. Morgan Stanley had 22 floors, and Merrill Lynch had an offices near. Both were heavily impacted. Heavy put options there, heavy put options on reinsurance companies, Munich Reinsurance, the largest in the world, AXA Reinsurance in France, which owned 25% of American. Totally out of whack, absolutely spiking. There's another newsletter that says very clearly, by a guy by the name of Phil Erlanger, and this is his newsletter, that the insider trading may have cost $1 billion. Now just these ones that were identified, produced only $2.5 million in instant profits for somebody who knew the attacks were going to take place. Nobody claimed the profits. The San Francisco Chronicle caught it shortly thereafter, and nobody has claimed them since. And we don't know who made the trades. But what did the Herzliya Institute for Counterterrorism tell us? It told us that the United Airlines put options were placed through the firm A.B. Brown. Do you remember A.B. Brown? A.B. Brown was the firm headed until 1998 by A.B. Buzzy Krongard, who is now the executive director of the Central Intelligence Agency.
Despite the fact that the fires in Building 7 were so small that the sprinkler system should have extinguished them, at about 5:30 in the evening, the building suddenly crumbled into a pile of rubble. How did a few little fires cause Building 7 to crumble? At the top of Building 7 is a rectangular penthouse that contains air conditioning and other equipment. If you recall, the fires were on the lower floors, not near the roof. However, the penthouse is the first part of the building to collapse. How could the fires cause damage to the penthouse without damaging all the floors in between? Without damaging all the floors in between? Without damaging all the floors in between? Here's a different view of the collapse. And another view.
Took a mere 1,000 pounds, detonated on 10 key floors. When this building was imploded into its own basement, it put the family into the record books. Implosion, the key to their success, is the science behind controlled demolition. Small amounts of explosives strategically placed and detonated in sequence.
The real damage that is done to the building comes from gravity.
Controlled Demolition is a company that demolishes old buildings. They demolished the building in Oklahoma City that Tim McVeigh was accused of blowing up. They were also hired to clean up the mess at the World Trade Center. They developed a special explosive and technique of using it for demolishing steel structures. They are so proud of this technology that they trademarked its abbreviation, DREXS. Their British division describes the technology as, "Our Drexus systems segment steel components into pieces matching the lifting capacity of the available equipment." One possible reason for the secrecy about Building 7 is that it may have been the control center for demolishing the World Trade Center. The 23rd floor of this building was given $15 million worth of renovations to make it into an emergency command center for Mayor Giuliani. For example, it was given bullet and bomb-resistant windows. There is nothing strange about adding reinforcements to a government office to protect them in case of attack. In fact, many retail businesses have bullet-resistant windows. However, this particular office had its own air and water supply, and it was designed to withstand winds of 160 miles per hour. To make the situation more suspicious, the reinforcements were only for this one floor, so that meant most of the building was just an ordinary office building. Why would they protect only one floor? Furthermore, why would they need their own air supply? And how about the protection from a 160-mile-per-hour wind? Well, consider that when the towers fell down, clouds of dust and grit were thrown outward at a very high speed. The only people protected from that blast were in this special emergency command center. Of course, the city government claims the entire building was evacuated at 9 in the morning, so nobody was inside this special reinforced bunker when the towers collapsed. But did everybody really abandon Building 7? It would have been a great place for people to supervise the attack because the 23rd floor provided a wonderful view of the area, and the occupants were protected from the dust and debris. To make the situation even more suspicious, as I explain in more detail in the book, The flight paths of the two airplanes that hit the towers appear to have been on a course towards Building 7, as if this building was broadcasting a homing signal. The bomb that exploded in Oklahoma City in 1995. General Ben Parton is retired now, but he was one of the military's experts on explosives. Based on his experience, he did not believe that a mixture of fertilizer and fuel oil exploding in the street could have been responsible for the pulverized concrete at the Murrah building. He felt that the distance between the truck and the building was too great. Also, the non-symmetrical damage to the building was suspicious. He decided to go to Oklahoma City and investigate for himself. Explosives create incredible pressures that can pulverize concrete and rip apart steel beams. However, the farther away a building is from an explosive, the less intense the pressure will be. Furthermore, McVeigh's bomb was a mixture of fuel oil and fertilizer, and that type of bomb does not create pressures as high as RDX. This means that McVeigh's bomb had to be even closer to the concrete than a bomb of RDX. Was McVeigh's bomb close enough to the building? General Parton calculated the pressure from McVeigh's bomb at various distances. He created this chart to show the pressures. McVeigh's truck bomb is at the bottom of this chart. The columns that supported this building are shown as solid rectangles. The red rectangles are the columns that collapsed. The collapsed columns are in the area shaded with red. The columns in this building were made of concrete with steel reinforcing rods. They did not merely fall over, rather the concrete was pulverized, exposing bare reinforcing rods. Parton's calculations show that when the blast reached the outside of the building, it was a couple thousand pounds per square inch. This would have done a lot of damage to the outside of the building and the office furniture. But his calculations show that when the blast reached the columns, the pressure was too low to pulverize the concrete. One of the columns that was pulverized was so far from the bomb that the pressure would have been only 27 pounds per square inch. Parton also points out that the damage to the building was not symmetrical. The red shading shows the non-symmetrical area. The blast of hot gas was in the shape of a sphere, so that non-symmetrical area should not have occurred. The photograph on the left side is looking up at this non-symmetrical area. There is no way to explain how the truck bomb could have carved out this indentation. The only sensible explanation is that explosives had been placed on the column that supported this section of the building, and when those explosives were detonated, the column was shattered and this section collapsed. Parton's conclusion is that demolition explosives were placed in the building, and McVeigh's truck bomb was merely to fool people into believing that McVeigh was responsible.
The Justice Department is reporting that a second explosive device has been found in the AP Murrah building in downtown Oklahoma City. Mike, you're still with us, aren't you?
Yes, I am, and I might tell you in addition to that in fact, what we were told at the scene a few minutes ago was that, in fact, 2 different explosive devices were found in addition to the one that went off.
So a total of 3,
A total of 3.
Now confirmed through federal authorities that a second bomb has been found inside that federal building in Oklahoma City. It was an explosion at 9 o'clock this morning that did that damage you're looking at right there, blowing off the entire north face of that building.
I suppose that if all explosives had detonated, the damage to the building would have been symmetrical. Unless somebody can show that General Parton's calculations are wrong, the Oklahoma City bombing was a scam. Unfortunately, many people dismiss Parton on the grounds that if he was correct, the government wouldn't allow him to expose the scam. Now consider that unless somebody can show that Masson, I, and others are wrong, the September 11th attack was a sequel to the Oklahoma City bombing. The attacks were identical. For example, in Oklahoma, Tim McVeigh was the foolish patsy, a truck bomb grabbed the attention of the public, and demolition explosives that had been placed in the building before the attack were detonated while people were inside. On September 11th, Mohammed McVeigh was the foolish patsy, airplane crashes grabbed the attention of the public, and demolition explosives that had been placed in the buildings before the attack were detonated while people were inside. Furthermore, some of the same people and companies were used for the investigation and cleanup of both attacks, such as Gene Corley and Controlled Demolitions Incorporated. Whoever did the Oklahoma City bombing scam got away with it. This undoubtedly gave them confidence to expand to something bigger. And since they got away with the September 11th attack, they may be planning something even more spectacular.